History of the anti-vaccination movement. Don't get vaccinated, you'll become a calf. The COVID-19 pandemic has triggered an unprecedented rise in the anti-vaccine movement. People refused to be chipped en masse, and theories about the collusion of pharmaceutical companies, doctors and the world government flourished. However, this is not a new trend. Opponents of vaccination appeared soon after the invention of the first vaccine. Moreover, the arguments of modern anti-vaccinationists and their ideological predecessors from the 19th century are very similar. Let's find out why people were afraid that after vaccination they would turn into cows, and how Empress Catherine II fought the fears of her subjects. Vaccination is a conspiracy of doctors and the government. No one has the right to tell us how to dispose of our bodies. The composition of the drug is questionable, the action is untested, and the side effects are terrible and unpredictable. And in general, stop using us as guinea pigs. Think these are comments about a COVID-19 vaccine? No matter how. We quoted the arguments of the anti-vaxxers of the 19th century. The first vaccine in history was to defeat smallpox. This infection was a real plague of its time. It spread easily, it was possible to get infected by sneezing, coughing and even talking, and every year it affected millions of people around the world. Every third sick person died, and those who recovered often remained disabled. In the 18th century, smallpox was responsible for 8 to 20% of all deaths in European countries. As virologist Paul Offit writes in his book A Deadly Choice, what the fight against vaccinations threatens us all with, in total, more people died from smallpox than from the plague and from all the wars of the 20th century combined, about 500 million people. The smallpox vaccine was invented in 1796 by the English physician Edward Jenner. He often heard stories that milkmaids become immune to smallpox after they get cowpox, while cowpox is much easier than natural and is not transmitted from person to person. In May 1796, Jenner decided to experiment. He took the contents of a pustule from the milkmaid Sarah Nelms and introduced it to 8-year-old James Phipps. A few weeks later, he injected pus taken from a patient with smallpox under the skin of the boy, and the disease did not develop. The word vaccination comes from the Latin vaccinae, cows. A couple of years later, Jenner published a pamphlet, an investigation into the causes and effects of cowpox. Soon, first in Britain, and then in other countries, mass vaccination began, and mortality from smallpox dropped sharply. But not all citizens followed the advice of doctors, and vaccinations in Britain were made mandatory. The 1853 bill declared that every infant should be vaccinated in the first 3 months of life. The next bill in 1867 tightened the rules. Now all children under 14 had to be vaccinated, and evasion threatened parents with a fine. If the family did not have money for a fine, its property was confiscated and sold at auction, and if this was not enough, one of the parents was sent to a debtor's prison. This is where resistance arose. The government for the first time encroached on what had previously been a private matter for everyone. Parents did their best to protect their children from vaccines. Some moved immediately after giving birth so that officials could not trace them. Others bought fake vaccination certificates. And those who still failed to avoid vaccination, sometimes even tried to suck the poison from under the skin of the child. Very soon the protest became organized. Almost immediately after the adoption of the bill, in 1853, the Anti-Vaccination League was founded, in 1866 the League of Compulsory Vaccination Fighters. 20 years later it had 100 chapters across Britain and over 10,000 members, and by 1900, about 200 more anti-vaccination leagues had been founded by British citizens. The motives were different. For some it was a matter of privacy. They were more worried about the forced procedure. Others were guided by religious considerations. Others preferred alternative medicine and opposed all traditional methods of treatment. The fourth did not like that they were allegedly experimented on. Vaccine fighters published leaflets and brochures, organized spontaneous rallies at auctions, where they sold the property of draft dodgers, engaged in, as they would say now, actionism, for example, staged a mock children's funeral or a symbolic execution of an effigy of Edward Jenner, and, of course, distributed a huge amount of fake vaccines. The fakes concerned both the composition of vaccines. Activists claimed that Jenner's vaccine contained viper venom, blood, entrails and excrement of bats, toads and blind puppies, and their effects, the vaccine allegedly turned a healthy baby into a brainless scrofulous monkey, a terrible freak with rotting skin. Less educated people even believed that after vaccination their children would turn into cows, especially since there were many witnesses who saw with their own eyes vaccinated children with calf muzzles, who ran on all fours and lowed. There were stories that after vaccination, white children can turn into blacks. All this is not so different from the arguments of modern anti-vaxxers that the vaccine is built into the DNA and changes the person at the gene level. And in general, the rhetoric of opponents of vaccines of the 19th century is painfully reminiscent of the modern one. Unless the current anti-vaccinationists use pseudoscientific terms, which makes their arguments sound more convincing for people far from medicine. But the essence was exactly the same. The government allegedly wants to destroy its own people. Doctors are minions of evil, and far more people die from vaccines than from the disease itself, from which they are designed to protect. In addition, vaccines for some diseases cause others. The smallpox vaccine allegedly provoked diphtheria and polio. Compare with the common statement, vaccinations cause autism. And finally, vaccines are unnatural, and there is no need to poison your children with the devil's goo. Paul Offit, in his book, also cites the differences between Victorian anti-vaxxers and modern ones. The main thing is that in the 19th century, vaccines were resisted mainly by the poor and poorly educated segments of the population, while today in Western countries representatives of the middle class with higher education more often become anti-vaccinators. And in general, in prosperous Western countries, the anti-vaccination movement is much more developed than in poor ones. In the end, the British government could not resist. In 1898, a law was passed that abolished fines and allowed conscience clauses to refuse vaccinations. In the first year after the adoption of the law, the authorities were forced to issue more than 200,000 exemptions from vaccinations. Vaccination rates in England have plummeted. Anti-vaccination movements in the 19th century were actively developing in other countries. In the United States, where such sentiments appeared thanks to missionaries from Great Britain, but fell on fertile ground, Boston became the capital of the movement. In Stockholm, a strong anti-vaccination campaign led to a drop in vaccinated coverage to 40%, against 90% coverage in the rest of the country. Only after the worst epidemic of 1873 to 1874 did confidence in vaccination return. In the Russian Empire, one of the first ambassadors of vaccination against smallpox was Empress Catherine II. It would be more accurate to call the procedure variolation. They opened the abscess of a person suffering from smallpox in a mild form with a knife, and then they made an incision on the healthy skin with the same blade. In 1768, Dr. Thomas Dimsdale vaccinated her with smallpox, after which she ordered that both her heir, the future Emperor Paul I, and her grandchildren be vaccinated. Soon, variolation became mandatory for certain categories of the population of the Russian Empire, primarily students, for example, for students of the Academy of Arts, the Cadet Corps and other educational institutions. At the beginning of the 19th century, the procedure was replaced by a safer vaccination according to the Jenner method. But despite such strong support from above, anti-vaccination sentiment was also strong in the Russian Empire. By decree of the Synod of 1804, even parish priests were engaged in the promotion of vaccination. They were supposed to tell the parishioners about the harmlessness of this method and turn them away from disagreeing to accepting it. True, many shied away from such assignments. In the 19th century, smallpox vaccination became mandatory for recruits, railway employees, exiles, orphans and some educational institutions. Everyone else could be vaccinated free of charge and voluntarily. But, despite the regular deadly outbreaks of smallpox and the availability of vaccinations, this measure was not popular. Unlike the UK, the protest in Russia was not organized in the same way. Parents simply evaded vaccinations under various pretexts. However, in the 20th century, the anti-vaccination movement almost all over the world began to decline. According to Columbia University professor James Colgrove, in the middle of the century there was a peak of trust and respect for official medicine. Largely precisely because at that time there were many breakthroughs in the field of vaccination, for example, the invention of a vaccine against polio. But it didn't last long. On April 19, 1982, the documentary, DPT, Vaccine Roulette, was released in the United States, and Paul Offit considers this date to be the birthday of the modern anti-vaccine movement. The film claimed that the government and doctors allegedly covered up the harm from the vaccine. As proof, they showed unfortunate children allegedly affected by the DTP vaccine. And although what was shown in the film was very far from reality, the avalanche provoked by it could no longer be stopped. Thousands of parents discovered side effects from the DTP vaccination in their children. A wave of publications about the victims swept the country. As a result, more and more parents began to refuse it and doubt all vaccines in general.
Thank you for watching. Reading is boring, so we will be sharing interesting things about world and life with you. Share, like and subscribe, you know what to do. Leave a comment what you are interested in so we can do an episode about it too.